think the significant thing about this place is that it's somewhere where normal people in the valley lived, and we really don't know much about normal people in the valley in the medieval period. Holwick here, there's a whole series of these settlements along the side of the valley. About every half mile or so there's a little hamlet that people lived in medieval times.
We marked out quite a lot of territory actually over the space of probably about a year or so to pick out all of the earthworks that you can see here running over the ridges, and as well as what looked like signs of early settlement, and we mapped them out, and Wellhead happened to be the one that we picked out. It does have, of course, one or two advantages in terms of location, being right next to the pub, but it is one of a number of places that looked as though good candidates to establish the early pattern of settlement in this part of Teesdale from what we'd seen from the landscape survey.
These are the stories that formal history bypasses completely. The sort of history that we learn about is about battles, and it's about politics and kings and queens, and it's about people at a very specific sort of end of society. But this is about the history of the ordinary people who lived here. There's history that doesn't get passed on, that doesn't get written about, but which is absolutely vitally important to our understanding of why we're all here.
Well, we started our survey here in 2017 in the May, and then we came back to do a site down there, which I'll take you to. And we dug that one in 2017, which was a medieval longhouse. A longhouse is where you keep the cattle at one end.
We found that the pottery on this site dates from probably the 1100s right through to about 1700. Found glassware as well from the later part of that period. We've got radiocarbon dates on a couple of the hearths, and they show dates in the 1500s, so in the middle of that period. But of course, when you take a radiocarbon date from a hearth, you're dating the last time the hearth was used. All the charcoal from previous uses would have been swept away, so you're really seeing the last use of those hearths, which was in the 1500s, but they're probably in use for a long time before that.
I think you've got to bear in mind that some people will live here permanently. Some might have come here seasonally, and some might have come just to mine some iron, smelt it and take it away. So the people of Teesdale are three different groups, and the people who lived here permanently didn't necessarily live here for centuries. So buildings went in and out of use as it became less or more economic to actually live here. You see, in a place like this, and I work right down through the Dales to Bishopdale, in Swaledale and the rest of North Yorkshire, people who lived here depended on the outside world for things they couldn't do. This was not a good place to grow bread wheat. It's not a good place to grow flax, any crop that needs deep roots. So what they had here had to be traded for the stuff they couldn't do for themselves. So they were dependent on places beyond here, some at great distance, you know.
We think that there has been continuity on the site over hundreds of years. And that makes it more exciting again, to the point where we might find some 13th century pot lying alongside some clay pigeon pieces. This stuff has been lying around here for hundreds of years. All this leads to just such an exciting investigation, and it has to be resolved.
Well, you start off by doing a proper survey because you want a detailed plan of what you're going to be digging. So we did a proper survey of the whole field using theodolite and GPS systems to try and get an idea of it. And also doing a survey gives you a chance to get to know the place. It's funny, walking around a landscape, at first you don't really understand what you're seeing, but after you walked over a field a few times, you begin to get a feel for how people might have lived and exploited the field.
It's not just about what we dig up, it's about the people who lived here. To be honest, that's my main interest. I find sort of maybe the corner of a building and I want to know who lived there. And why it was built in that particular place, and it can tell us a lot about why a settlement existed where it did. You know, we've got the settlement here, and then it moved, and we don't know why. It's a complete mystery. There's no records of it.
As things appear as you excavate, it brings in another insight into what the site was all about.
Yes.
And so you get a better understanding of the history of the place and what people did in this place, as far ago as the Bronze Age, for example.
When we first surveyed the field, we were puzzled slightly by a slightly curving wall on the far side of the spring, away from all the medieval stuff. And we wondered whether it might be prehistoric, something a bit earlier, because it was curving, and people tended to live in round houses until the Romans had gone. So we did put a trench in last year, just a little one, just to see what it was, and to our surprise we found that it was man-made. It was definitely a man-made wall, but some visiting prehistoric archaeologists and our own Paul Frodsham thought that it looked a bit like a Bronze Age cairn, maybe a funeral monument for the Bronze Age. And we sent away some charcoal we found underneath the flat stones and been radiocarbon dated, and indeed, yes, it is Bronze Age. The radiocarbon dates came back as 1800 BC, which is exactly the date you expect for this kind of cairn. These are thought to have been a way that the first farmers, as they moved into the area, kind of established their right to the area. It's on a ridge by the spring, and this was to make a statement, probably. It was the stones they cleared from the land to clear it ready for ploughing and for grazing. And the stones were put into this monument where they'd also bury their ancestors. As a way of saying to other people coming to the area, this land is mine, my ancestors cleared it, my ancestors still live in it, my family owns this by right.
These people were farming, they were quarrying, they were mining, and they might have done all three during the year. And then also during the year they probably took their stock off the good land at the bottom, up onto those hills into sheilings, what's called transhumance in Europe. We call it summer farming in the UK. And the signs are up there of people doing that. In fact, last year we talked to a lady whose dad used to farm here, and she remembered him driving his cattle up through that path just beyond us onto the fells during the summer. Same thing going on right into the modern day.
We learn an awful lot from listening to people. I think that's one of the things that sometimes gets neglected in archaeology. It can be very technical, and people get very kind of, and rightly so, very involved in the sort of the technical details and the sampling and the dating and things like that. And sometimes we forget to listen to people, you know, the people who can actually tell us about, you know, actually solve the problem for us. We found also, for example, on this site, we found all sorts of bits of china and artifacts and sort of like general kind of like stuff that was completely inexplicable. And then somebody who, one of the locals who came to have a look round, said that probably sort of like 40s, 50s, people used to come up here on picnics. Like the whole village used to come for a picnic. And so they just used to leave all stuff. So all the pop bottles, we found sort of pop bottles and stoppers and things like that, which was sort of like, well, there was no explanation for it until somebody came and told us.
You have to limit the size of the holes you dig, because if you dig too much you won't have time to properly record it and to fill it back in again. it's easy to get over ambitious and try and find out too much. You have to have limited targets and places you think are going to answer questions that you have got, like how many people lived here, what these buildings were used for, things like that.
The other interesting thing with it is seeing how so many things haven't changed. Perhaps with a doorway with a stone across. In that building, there was an area at the bottom end for the animals, and that there appeared to be a threshold stone, but there was another one above it, but it had a gap between, so that you could let the drainage of the effluent, if you like, out through it. And it's just these little things where you think, oh, somebody worked that one out. It makes it that much more interesting. Or some of the pots or the other artefacts that really haven't changed that much in hundreds of years.
Some of the families stayed a very long time. Others came and went. So the ones that stayed a long time, you get some idea of who they were and where their relations were. Now, in this particular place, we know that in 1607 it was occupied by a family called Jordan. 1623, the will of one of the family, the father, is in the archives in West Yorkshire in Leeds, and his son dies 1666. He leaves a will as well, and both those wills list the kind of furniture they had, the kind of animals they had. It looks as though at that particular time, those Jordans kept cattle. There's no mention of any mining tools or equipment, and they had relatives all over. Far away as Durham, there was a mayor of Durham called Jordan, I think in 1660. And you find that with all these families. The big families like the Robinsons and the Rains, you'll find members of their family scattered right through Loondale, right down to the Boulder. So you didn't just have the families, you had cousins and aunties, they married into each other's families, and you get relationships like that. So they're very close-knit communities.
There's a lot of people in Holwick whose families have been here for several generations, and so they know some of the answers, but a lot of it goes much further back, and they are genuinely really kind of interested in what their forebears were doing here and what their relationship was with the land.
The side of the hill and scooped out. And there are lots of buildings.
Historically, there's been not much in the way of archaeology in this area for the last 30 years. So the whole of the North Pennines was fairly neglected. And this was a concern of the North Pennines AONB, who wanted to promote archaeology in the area. So they set up a Heritage Lottery funded project starting in 2011, when it finally got off the ground, to involve local people in a whole series of digs and surveys. But of course everything must end, the money ran out, and so around 2015, as it was coming to an end, what we decided to do was to carry on as an archaeology group, this time run by the volunteers themselves and self-funded, to cover the whole of the North Pennines.
It's a community project, and that's a great way of organising an archaeological dig, because everybody, a much wider audience, can get involved in. People can come and go and give as much time as they can or not. So I think it's a really good way of helping local people be more involved in finding out about the heritage.
It's all relevant to where we've come from and where we're going, really. It's if we don't understand how the land's been used or whatever, then we don't understand how to take care of it and continue the proper, sensible use of it.
Yes, you would want to know where you belong. This is what it was like hundreds of years ago, and here we are now, and here's evidence of people who came before us. Why not? Why not?